There is a ledger sitting in the National Archives that nobody talks about. It is not classified. It is not sealed. It has been available to researchers for over 100 years. It lists, in precise columns, the names of American companies, railroads, land development firms, industrial merchants, and next to each name, a dollar amount, a donation. A contribution to what was publicly described as one of the most compassionate humanitarian programs in American history. The program moved over 200,000 children across the country in roughly 40 years. The ledger tells you who paid for it, and the moment you understand who paid for it, every single decision that program made, where it sent the children, how long they had to stay, what information they were allowed to have, stops looking like charity. It starts looking like a supply chain. The program I'm talking about is the placing out system run by the New York Children's Aid Society beginning in the 1850s, operating well into the 20th century. You may know it under a different name: the Newsboys Lodging Houses, the Farm Placement Movement, or simply the system that took poor children off city streets and sent them west to rural families. The official story is clean and emotionally legible. American cities in the mid-1800s had a child poverty crisis. New York alone had tens of thousands of children living on the streets, begging, stealing, sleeping in doorways. A man named Charles Loring Brace decided to do something about it. He founded the Children's Aid Society. He organized transportation. He placed children with rural families where, in his words, honest labor and clean air would save them from a life of crime and degradation. 200,000 children saved. That is the story in the textbook. Now let me tell you what is in the documents. Brace's 1872 book is titled The Dangerous Classes of New York, not the suffering children of New York, not the forgotten children of New York, the dangerous classes. His argument in that book is not primarily about child welfare. It is about urban labour surplus and what happens to a city's social stability when too many poor young men without work begin to organise, radicalise and demand things. Brace was explicit. The street children were not a humanitarian problem to be solved. They were a political threat to be managed. The programme, in his own language, existed to drain off this population before it could become dangerous to the social order. That framing, drain off, is not accidental language. It is economic language. And when you understand that the man who designed this system was thinking in economic terms, the routine decisions start making a very different kind of sense. Here is the pattern researchers have documented in the placement records. Town after town after town that received these children had in the years immediately preceding the placement experienced a catastrophic labour shock. Fire, mostly. A mill burns. A warehouse burns. Farm infrastructure burns. Workers die or leave. And then, within 3 to 5 years, children arrive. Not to every town. Not on a perfect schedule. But with a frequency that breaks statistical coincidence by the time you have checked enough states. You check one state and you think, interesting. You check 3 states and you think, that's a pattern. You check 7 states and you stop explaining it as coincidence. The children were not being sent to the best homes. They were being sent to the places with the worst labour deficits. Now ask the obvious question, who was paying for this? The Children's Aid Society's own donation records, held today at the Social Welfare History Archives at the University of Minnesota, show the organisation receiving substantial recurring funding from New York's merchant and manufacturing class throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Among the names that appear repeatedly, representatives of the railroad industry. Specifically, interests connected to lines that were, at that exact moment, actively developing land grants in the Western and Midwestern territories where the children were being sent. Think about what that means. The railroads had land in underpopulated territories. That land had no value without population. Population meant freight. Freight meant revenue. But getting families to settle on raw Western land was slow and expensive. Children placed through the Children's Aid Society cost almost nothing to transport. The railroads offered the placement cars at deeply discounted rates, in some documented cases approaching free. A railroad developing Kansas territories was subsidizing the movement of juvenile labor into Kansas territories and calling it charity. One internal memo from approximately 1869, quoted in an academic paper from 1947, describes routine considerations for the following year's placements. The language it uses to describe ideal destination communities includes a phrase that, once you read it, you cannot unread. Conditions favorable to absorption. That phrase is defined in the same document as recent population loss, active reconstruction, or demonstrated shortage of juvenile labor. Conditions favorable to absorption. Written about children. The 1947 scholar who quoted that memo did not find the language remarkable. That tells you something about how thoroughly the philanthropic framing had already buried what the documents actually say. The children who boarded those trains were not told where they were going. This is documented extensively in oral histories collected in the 1980s and 1990s, survivor testimony from former riders who were still alive to speak. They were told they were going to good homes. They were told the country was better than the city. Most were not told the name of the destination town. Most were not told the name of the receiving family. And critically, they were not given the name of anyone outside the immediate community they could contact if the placement was bad. This was not an oversight. The placement guidelines, revised in 1868 and again in 1876, explicitly instructed agents not to provide children with information about external contacts or complaint mechanisms until the placement had been deemed stable. Stable was defined as one full agricultural season. If a child arrived in spring and the situation was brutal, no one was obligated to check on them until autumn. If they ran, they were legally classified as vagrant, which returned them to exactly the institutional pipeline they came from. They had no standing to refuse, no standing to contact biological family, no legal pathway out, and if a biological family asked too many questions, they were told that contact would disrupt the child's adjustment. The system was sealed from every direction. One placement agent named Catherine Sellers wrote to her supervisor in 1882 with a concern. She had revisited a community in central Iowa for a second placement cohort. The children from the first cohort were, in her words, well occupied but not schooled beyond the minimum, and several boys were performing labor she described as intensive for their ages. She asked, "Should we continue sending children here?" Her supervisor's response was 3 sentences. He acknowledged her concern. He noted that the receiving families had expressed satisfaction with the arrangements. He instructed her to proceed. Satisfaction of the receiving families, not the welfare of the children, not the safety of the children, the satisfaction of the families who had received them. Sellers continued making placements in that community for 4 more years. The WPA Oral History Collection at the Library of Congress includes interviews from 1936 and 1937, elderly Americans who grew up in receiving communities and watched the trains arrive. Several of them describe it not as a charitable event. They describe it as something closer to a market day. Children lined up in church halls, families walking through, selecting. One man, identified only as J.H. from Kansas, interviewed when he was elderly, describes watching an arrival as a boy of 9. He says the bigger boys were the ones the farmers wanted first. The smaller ones waited longer. One boy younger than him sat on a trunk for most of the afternoon and was still there when his family left to go home. He never found out what happened to that boy. That boy, if he was placed that day, grew up with no knowledge of where he had come from, no address for a biological family, no legal recourse. His entire existence, from that afternoon forward, defined by the labour needs of a family that selected him from a hall in a county that had burned and was rebuilding. His grandchildren would have been told a family story that started with an arrival, a platform, a farm, no before. The documents that explain how this system actually worked are not hidden. They are in state historical archives. They are in university collections. They are in federal records. They have been available for decades. They have simply never been placed next to each other and read as a single story. When you place them next to each other, the story they tell is not about well-intentioned people who made some mistakes. It is about a system that worked exactly as it was designed to work. The burned towns needed labour. The cities needed the children gone. The railroads needed the territories populated. The Children's Aid Society needed the funding. 4 problems, 1 solution, dressed in the language of rescue.